Hello and welcome to Inside the Vault. My name is Sandy Trenholm and I'm the collection director for the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History. And tonight we're going to be talking about the surrender of Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia on the anniversary of Lee's surrender. So very excited to be doing that tonight with Dr. Caroline Janney. And so it's my pleasure tonight to introduce Dr. Caroline Janney. Carrie is the John L. Nau Professor of American Civil War, and she's also the director of the John L. Nau Center of Civil War History at the University of Virginia. She's published 7 books, which is absolutely amazing, including Ends of War, which is very appropriate for what we're discussing tonight. And you won the Lincoln Prize in 2022. But also, spoiler alert, Carrie also worked for the National Park Service, and she's an archivist too. So I'm really excited to talk to you about documents tonight. Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Sure. So I've been teaching at Virginia for 6 years now. I taught at Purdue for many years. So last night, basketball was fun to watch, disappointing outcome. But I have been a student of history for as long as I could remember. It's not something that I thought I would make a career out of, but I was blessed to have wonderful teachers along the way that showed me that path. And so I love being in the classroom, the energy that I get from students. I love talking to teachers. My mom was a 5th grade history teacher. So I feel like it's just the greatest job in the world to get to do this.
Amazing. I love talking to teachers and students too. It heightens my energy, which heightens their energy, and it really creates a lot of passion around the subject. So with that, we are going to move over to our documents for today, which I say this every time, are some of my favorite documents from the collection. We have used these quite a bit with groups that came into the collection, and they never fail to really spark in. Carrie, you've been an archivist, like, that spark of a moment where people get it, and there's like this wow, awe moment of this is the really real thing. And that's actually a quote from people who comment, is it the really real one? But I'm not going to tell you too much about them right now. We're going to talk about them later. I'm going to turn it over here to Carrie, who is going to tell us a little bit more about the background and what's going on when these were created. So, Carrie?
Absolutely. So thank you, Sandy. As you mentioned, this is the anniversary of the surrender at Appomattox. In fact, it's the 159th anniversary. And these documents in and of themselves are fascinating. We could dive right into them, but I think it would be helpful to offer some context and understanding them as people at the time would have understood them. Part of that involves slowing down the narrative and thinking about how each one of these documents fits into a broader context and a timeline. And they're all part of the negotiations and the reaction to the surrender of Lee's army at Appomattox. To do so, we need to think about the military story of the war. And we could go down lots of rabbit holes here. There's so many things that are happening, but I wanted to give you just a very brief overview of what's happening in Virginia during the first 9 or so days of April 1865. The late winter of 1865, Union forces under Grant held Lee and his Army of Northern Virginia in a siege. The siege has been going on for about 10 months. Again, there's various attempts to break out March 25th at Fort Stedman, but the breakthrough for the Union lines will be on April 2nd. On April 2nd, the Union Army is able to break through Lee's lines. It means that the city of Petersburg is going to fall. Lee is going to have to evacuate Petersburg, but it also means that the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia is going to fall. What Lee decides to do next is not to surrender his army. We could potentially think that maybe April 2nd or April 3rd would have been the day of capitulation, the day in which the Army of Northern Virginia ceased to exist. But that was not on Lee's plan. And as he makes his way west, he's not thinking about a retreat to Appomattox. He's not thinking about this as necessarily the final campaign. The writing is on the wall, but what he wants to do is to take his forces along the Richmond and Danville Railroad that you might be able to see coming there out of Richmond, move them south into North Carolina, where they can join forces with the forces under Joseph E. Johnston, another significant Confederate army. So he's going to try to push west and southwest, moving along that railroad line, but all along the way, Union forces under Grant, under Meade and the Army of the Potomac, under General Sheridan are going to cut off his avenues of trying to make his way south. He makes his way all the way to Sailor's Creek by April 6th. Sailor's Creek is the scene of 3 desperate fights that day, and this absolutely decimates Lee's army. Some 8,000 Confederate soldiers are forced to surrender. This is about a quarter of Lee's remaining forces. They're overwhelmed by Union troops. And at this point, this means that Lee is outnumbered about 3-1. He has few options left, and Grant is well aware of this. We should bring them in that we're talking to center stage here. On April 7th, so right after the disaster at Sailor's Creek, Lee is going to receive the first of a series of notes from Grant calling for his surrender. So on April 7th, Grant writes this in part. He says, "The results of last week must convince you of the hopelessness of further resistance." Lee receives this note, and again, things are looking pretty bad, but Lee is not yet ready to surrender. Instead, after conferring with his officers, Longstreet in particular, he decides that he, in fact, is not going to surrender. He's going to push forward. He's going to have another night march. This will be the 3rd night march in the row for the Army of Northern Virginia. And he's going to hope against all hope that he can unite his forces with Johnston's. But he is going to reply to Grant's note, and he replies that he's not yet convinced that the situation is hopeless. Nevertheless, he asks Grant what sort of terms he might be willing to offer. Well, on the morning of April 8th, Lee's note to Grant arrives at Grant's headquarters. And by this time, Grant is suffering from a migraine. He was known to suffer from migraines throughout the war. He has a particularly bad one this morning, on the morning of April 8th. He's in no mood to negotiate, but he pens a second note to General Lee, informs him that his only condition of surrender was that the men and officers would be surrendered. They would be disqualified from taking up arms again against the United States, that they would do so until properly exchanged. Grant writes, "I will meet you or designate officers or designate officers to meet any officers you may name for the purpose of arranging definitively the terms upon which the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia will be received." So Lee gets this note on April 8th. This is Grant's second letter now that he's written to Lee. Again, Lee is going to respond to Grant. He observes that he hadn't proposed to surrender. Keep in mind, he had asked what Grant's terms of surrender might be if he decided to surrender. So Grant says, Lee says, I hadn't proposed to surrender. To be frank, Lee writes, I do not think the emergency has arisen to call for the surrender of this army. But as the restoration of peace should be the sole object of all, I desire to know whether your proposals would lead to that end. I think this is a fascinating piece of writing here. We can see Lee hedging. He says, I didn't say I was going to surrender. I wanted to know what your terms were if I was thinking about it. And really what I want is the restoration of peace. Lee says in his note that if Grant agrees to tell him what this is about, he'll meet him between the lines at 10 o'clock on the morning of April 9th to discuss this. In the meantime, though, Lee's army is going to continue to fight. It's important that we keep in mind that as this exchange of letters between the two commanders is going back and forth, there are still active armies in the field. There will be a small but decisive battle at Appomattox Station on April 8th. The Union cavalry absolutely is victorious in this small battle. And on the morning of April 9th, there will be fighting as well. So near midnight, so here we are, night of April 8th into the morning of April 9th, a courier arrives at Grant's headquarters with Lee's response. And despite the hedging tone of Lee's letter, Grant knows that Lee has very few options at this point. What's happening is the Union armies are surrounding the Confederate forces. They're going to ultimately surround them on 3 sides. So around 8:30 on the morning of April 9th, even as the armies are still fighting, Lee knows that in his last note that he had sent to Grant, he said, "I'll meet you between the lines at 10 a.m." So he starts forward to meet with Grant as his letter had promised. Well, before he can meet up with Grant, his aides encounter one of General Meade's staff members. General Meade is the commander that's in charge of the largest of the forces that are under Grant's command, the Army of the Potomac. And with him, he has Grant's reply from Lee's last letter. And Grant says this, he says, "I have no authority to treat on the subject of peace. Therefore, a meeting would be of no use." So he's telling Lee, peace is a political matter. All I can deal with is the surrender of your army. I can negotiate that. That is a military matter. I can't deal with peace. But Lee knows that his army is encircled at this point. He has infantry out in front of him at Appomattox Courthouse. He's now completely surrounded. He has no choice but to surrender, which brings us to our first document. This is what Lee writes to Grant on the morning of April 9th, requesting a meeting to deal with the surrender of his army. Grant will write back. We'll discuss this document more in just a bit, but Grant writes back. Within an hour, there's a ceasefire along the lines as they wait for Grant and Lee to meet. The place that's chosen for their meeting happens to be the McLean House, a home in the very small village of Appomattox Courthouse. Grant arrives there around 1:30 p.m. He has a few members of his staff with him. He climbs the steps of the McLean House, where he will meet with Lee and one of Lee's staff members for the first time during the war. At this meeting, Grant is going to pen the surrender terms. These are his very generous terms. In this picture, we can see Grant has already written his terms. He's now sent them over to Lee. We'll come back to this in just a moment. But the terms bring us to our second document. They go like this. There's 3 things that are part of the surrender terms. First, the soldiers in the Army of Northern Virginia will be paroled. They'll be paroled prisoners of war. Second, the arms, the artillery, the public property of the Confederate Army would be turned over to the United States, but officers would be allowed to keep their personal sidearms, their baggage, and their horses. Third, and most importantly, Grant's most original, his most noteworthy addition to the terms was the final provision, the provision that Confederates would, quote, "be allowed to return to their homes, not to be disturbed by United States authority, so long as they observe their paroles and the laws in force where they reside." Grant had overseen 2 other surrenders by this point. This is the only surrender in which this sort of language appears. It's very evident that Grant knows that this is not only the end of Lee's army, but hopefully the end of the war. And this language is incredibly important from a legal perspective, from ideas found in the laws of war. Because by including this provision, Grant is tacitly acknowledging that Lee's soldiers were enemy combatants. In other words, they couldn't be tried for treason for their actions during the war. Enemy soldiers can be defeated, but they can't be prosecuted. And so he is saying this in the language here. Grant writes out these terms. He then sends them over to Lee to read. Importantly, Lee doesn't sign these terms. What Lee's going to do, as this picture demonstrates, is he's going to write his own letter in response to Grant accepting the terms. So we have these terms on the table. It's important that we remember that these men are prisoners of war. that they have agreed to terms that say that they have been surrendered, they're prisoners of war, they can no longer fight again. But Lee is worried about this. He's worried that as his men make their way home from Appomattox, how are they going to prove that, in fact, they've surrendered, that they are indeed paroled prisoners of war? Grant and Lee are going to meet once more, as this lithograph depicts, on the morning of April 10th. And during this, they're going to have a conversation about the logistics. How are Lee's men going to prove that they can get home? How are they even going to get home? Because they're going to have to pass through Union lines, places that are occupied, such as Richmond, for example, or maybe they're from Alexandria, or maybe from another occupied city in the South. How are they going to get through those Union lines? Well, to this, Grant responds by issuing a special field order, Special Orders number 73, that says that all of Lee's men who have surrendered, who've been paroled, are allowed to pass through those Union lines, that they will be allowed to use government transports, meaning military railroads or steamers, if they have proof that they have, in fact, been paroled. Well, how do you get proof that you've been paroled? Lee says, look, they have nothing that says this. Well, one of Grant's generals, General John Gibbon, had a printing press with him. And he was called over by Grant, and Grant asked him to print some sort of pass that would allow these men to go home. So what you see before you is the printing press that you can now go visit at Clover Hill Tavern at Appomattox Courthouse at the National Military Park, as well as an example of one of the parole passes. There, if you've ever seen these, you might notice there are 3 different designs that you find. If you see the press in front of you, there were 3 different floral designs that you might find. But all of these printed there at Appomattox to be filled out, I should point out, by the Confederate officers. The Union officials aren't going to fill this out. Instead, it's going to be Confederates who do this. So this is the proof that men will carry home with them. If this is how it's ending, I think it's important that we talk about what reaction is in the field. Well, let's start on the Union side. When word of the surrender reaches the Union lines, because remember, there's been a ceasefire, rumor has been spreading all along that Grant is meeting with Lee, that this is potentially the end. But when word officially comes that, in fact, Lee's army has finally surrendered, that the war is over, this is what Colonel Theodore Lyman of General Meade's headquarters wrote to his wife on April 9th. He said, "Such a scene followed as I can never see again. The soldiers rushed, perfectly crazy, to the roadside, and there, crowding in dense masses, shouted, screamed, yelled, threw up their hats, and hopped madly up and down. The batteries were run out and began firing. The bands played, the flags waved. The noise of the cheering was such that my very ears rang. And there was General Meade, galloping about and waving his cap with the best of them." So picture this moment of euphoria. There are stories of men taking blankets and bouncing each other up and down in the air. They're celebrating. They have a wonderful feast that night. This is the Army of the Potomac, the army that had fought so long against Lee's army and had in so few instances come away with a clear-cut victory. And now they have forced that army to capitulate. The army that was the heart and soul of the Confederacy by this point. As you might imagine, Confederate reaction across the Appomattox River, where the Confederates are bivouacked, was starkly different. As word of Lee's surrender started to reach the men, his war-worn veterans began to cry, openly weep. Many of them had waited for Lee as he rode back to camp that afternoon. He had muttered only a few words as he rode back into camp. But later that evening, he asked one of his aides, Charles Marshall, to draft a farewell order to the army that might be delivered before the men disbanded. Which brings us to our third document. This is an address that that he asked Charles Marshall to produce. He sent him into an ambulance, told him not to talk to anyone until it was done. There's a paragraph that Lee had deleted. We don't know what was in that paragraph, but Marshall tells us that some of the language was too harsh, and Lee asked him to rewrite it. After this has been written, there are copies that are distributed to the corps commanders and to the various staff officers. And the men are called to fall into formation without arms, and the officers will read this farewell address, General Orders Number 9, to the men. Lee does not read it. There are many different, various different levels. Sometimes it's the corps commander, sometimes it's the division commander that's reading this to the men as they stand and listen to it. In this order, which apparently Lee forgot that he had surrendered an army, so he technically shouldn't be issuing orders at this point. But he lauded the loyalty, the valor, the unsurpassed courage and fortitude of the brave survivors of so many hard-fought battles. He assured them that the surrender was through no fault of their own. Instead, he insisted that the army had been, quote, compelled to yield to overwhelming numbers and resources. It's really important that we see in this general order that Lee is crafting what will be the seeds of the lost cause. Here on the field, where Grant had offered such magnanimous terms, Lee has put into writing, put into words, two of what will become the central tenets of the lost cause. That is the Confederate mythology, the best case scenario that explains why Confederates fought and why they lost. Those two pieces that we see in the General Orders Number 9 are, first, that Confederate soldiers had been devoted, honorable, chivalric, and second, that they had not been defeated, that they had merely been worn down, that they had been overwhelmed by superior Northern materiel, by superior numbers of Northern forces. The language that Lee invokes here sounds like mercenaries, foreign hirelings, and so on. So with this, Lee's men will begin to disperse from Appomattox. One of the important questions that we should ask ourselves is, was the war over at this point? Well, many Unionists believed that the surrender of Lee and the most important Confederate army meant that the war was over, or at least nearly over. General Meade, for example, of the Army of the Potomac, wrote to his wife on the night of April 10th that the events at Appomattox had, quote, virtually ended the war. In New York City, George Templeton Strong observed that people, quote, hold the war virtually ended. Lee is out of the game. And the New York Times proclaimed, quote, the fratricidal slaughter is all over with Lee's surrender. And on April 12th, as the remnants of Lee's army participated in one final march, a surrender parade up the hill from the river toward Appomattox Courthouse, where they would surrender their flags, their arms, stack their muskets before they departed home. Even as this is happening, there are still those who hold out hope that the Confederate cause is not yet lost. In Richmond, a Confederate clerk refused to take the oath because he still believed his country would survive. The Confederacy is very ill, he wrote that day, but I still haven't lost all hope. 2 days later, it was apparent why some hadn't lost all hope. The night of April 14th, the famous actor John Wilkes Booth would shoot Abraham Lincoln in the head, and by the next morning, the president had died. I want you to consider the wave of emotion that had happened in a single week, from the euphoria and jubilation of news on Palm Sunday, on April 9th, that Lee had capitulated. And by the next week, Easter Sunday, the president had been assassinated. It was clear that there was an attack planned when the vice president, Seward, the Secretary of State, had likewise been attacked. It wasn't clear that, in fact, this war was over. Grant's magnanimous efforts might all have been in jeopardy if this type of warfare, this type of guerrilla warfare, continued. All of this, though, was indeed the beginning of the end. It's important to point out that a significant portion of Lee's army, of the Army of Northern Virginia, did not surrender at Appomattox. There were only 26 to 28,000 members of his army who surrendered at Appomattox. There were still another 20,000 who needed to surrender. And in the days after Appomattox, Grant allowed for them to be surrendered as well. And the map that you see before you shows the host of places throughout Virginia, into West Virginia, even into North Carolina and Maryland, where members of Lee's army would finally turn themselves in, thanks to Grant's generous terms, meant to end the war. This would allow them to surrender with the same terms that had been offered to those who were at Appomattox. So if you ever come across a parole pass, such as this one, that might seem a bit confusing, this comes from Greensboro in May of 1865, but you can see that this was a private in the Army in Northern Virginia. He was one of those, as you can see, approximately a little more than 1,000 men who likewise should have surrendered at Appomattox, but for a host of different reasons had fled the army at some point along that movement from Richmond and Petersburg toward Appomattox Courthouse, and surrendered in Greensboro instead. Lee's surrender, the surrender of individual men such as John Dow, would lead to, of A.J. Brain, would lead to the surrender of other Confederate armies, including, for example, on April 26th, of General Joe Johnston's forces, the very forces that Lee had been trying to merge with. He has an army of approximately 30,000 that would surrender finally after a series of failed negotiations on April 26, 1865. His surrender would be followed by other capitulations, Kirby Smith and others, finally bringing the end to the formal armies by the summer of 1865. There is so much more to this story: how the soldiers made their way home, what the legal and practical considerations were along the way. Certainly the story of African Americans, both enslaved and free, those who were attached to the army and those who weren't. But I think now we should turn back to those documents and discuss those just a bit more.
Yeah, thank you. That was really fascinating. And before we turn to these documents, when you were speaking, I was reminded of a story. When you said, Lee could have surrendered on April 2nd, we have a soldier's collection, and one of our archivists was working on it. And there's Charles Morey. We have like 6 diaries, hundreds and hundreds of letters, joins at the beginning of the war. And the archivist was processing the collection, and they got to the end of the war, and he's like, ooh, I'm going to see something about Lee's surrender. Except he didn't, because when he turned over one of the letters, it was in someone else's handwriting, and it announced that Morey had died on April 2nd. And it's just that week, like, think of the lives that could have been saved in a week. Like, I always find that fascinating, that end of war story. But I also want to point out, like, when you look at documents and having your experience as an archivist and a historian, it's so much better to see them in person if you ever get the chance. Go to your local historical societies, libraries, because they're artifacts. They're not just pictures on the screen. And to give people a little bit of context, that first document it measures 9 by 8, so it's smaller than a sheet of paper. The second one is an 11.5 by 9, but the third one is actually 15 by 12. So it's like 2 sheets of paper side by side. And we've cropped it down a little bit. There's about 2 inches of extra space on each side. And when I work with people and they come to the collection, historians, kids, it doesn't matter. Seeing the real one always gives them a little bit of electric shock. Have you ever had that experience, Carrie?
Every time I'm in the archives, it never gets old, that you touch something and you know that there was that person was sitting there thinking those thoughts, and it's so simple, and yet it's so powerful to think about the creation of that document, and what circumstance, where were they sitting, what were they watching around them, what emotions were they feeling. There's just something incredibly powerful and stirring about being with the real documents.
Which is a great segue into this first one, because one of the things we definitely want to know is how can we use this in the classroom? What can people learn from resources like this? But also, how hard was this for Lee to write? You know, he's still very eloquent in this. I love the term suspension of hostilities. He's not saying ceasefire, but how hard do you think this was for Lee to write, and how can we use it in the classroom?
Well, I think it's important to think about this not as a one-off, that this is part of that exchange that, and you can get copies of that exchange. For example, in Grant's memoirs, he reproduces that whole back and forth. And to see Lee slowly wearing down, you can see him pushing back. And to think about how this is a very brief statement, but it's incredibly humbling of him at this point, even though he kept saying, no, I want to know what your terms are, but I'm not ready to surrender. And this real internal struggle that you can see him having. The date stamps on this are fascinating, to think about. Literally, I mean, from a military history perspective, where is he on the field? Who is he encountering? We can talk about the endorsement, if it's not exactly an endorsement, but the way in which it's going to pass through hands.
Yeah. And I think the fact that this is the entire transcript for Lee's portion. It's just one quick sentence, and so much happens because of that one quick sentence. It is in pencil. People always point out that it's duplicate. And interestingly enough, kids are surprised that Lee is writing in pencil. They don't understand how come he doesn't have a pen.
It's not very practical to carry an inkwell with you. I mean, they had them. They did, and his staff officers, his adjutants had those things, but a pencil is certainly much more portable and easier to use.
And then this is the docket that you had mentioned. So it's written by General Ord. I want to start by asking you, who is Ord?
So Ord was the commander of the Army of the James. Sometimes we forget that there were two major armies, and then Sheridan's command that was part of that pursuing force of that's under Grant's command. So Edward O.C. Ord was the commander of the Army of the James, and he happens to be within the lines that Lee is passing. And so he's going to receive this note first before it gets sent on to Grant. So there's several steps to go through. Should point out, in terms of Ord, he's a fascinating character. He was from Maryland. There were always people who doubted whether or not his loyalties were secure to the Union. He will be in charge of what becomes the Department of Virginia, or he's put in charge of the Department of Virginia, which means he's part of the occupying force in Richmond right after he leaves Appomattox. So there's a famous picture of him with the desk where Lee wrote his letter that was in that earlier picture that we looked at. He buys that, I think, for $40 or something, one of the many souvenirs that's taken from the McLean parlor, and has that with him. And he's photographed with it in Richmond only a few days after the surrender. But he just happens to be the nearest commander that this is going to pass through before it reaches Grant.
And you had asked before about provenance, which is the background of our documents. And this one was in William Hillyer's family, apologize for that, up until the 1980s. So they said Grant gave it to Hillier. The family just said Grant gave it to Hillier. So it's really interesting sometimes to see how those mementos sort of get passed around. They knew it was a momentous day. And so taking a little bit of souvenirs. Is there anything else that we should know about this document?
This is incredibly simple, but I think sometimes it's the little things that make it human. But the folds, you can imagine that this isn't just a piece of paper that's carried around, but you can see how many times it's been folded. I can imagine it was put in someone's pocket and ridden from Lee's headquarters to eventually passes through Ord. So, and you can tell where it's dirty in places where it would have been touched by so many different hands as it makes that route to make its way to Grant.
Yeah, and it's almost as if when they folded it, Lee's text was on the inside, so they fold it over and then they fold it in thirds, so it's more protected than the outside, which is much more dirty.
Mhm.
Okay, and so the second one, which is the copy of the surrender terms, I put them both pages side by side. And one of the interesting things when you use digital images, you can't always tell what something looks like. And so this document would have been a much larger piece of paper that they fold in half to make 4 pages. So we would call that a folio. But that is why you have this fold here. This other page is blank. And so what should we know about this one?
So I want, can you tell me about the provenance of this, and we can talk then about what would have happened in that room in terms of this particular
Absolutely.
letter?
Absolutely. So the story behind this one is that it was a copy written out by a Confederate officer for them to have with both the surrender terms and that Special Order 73.
Right, which then happened the next day, but you can see the importance that Confederates are attaching to both of those documents to have them together. So the actual surrender terms, I mentioned this in passing, but it's important to note that Grant is the only signature here. This isn't, it's not a treaty. It's not a peace treaty. A peace treaty is only between political authorities. Grant only has the authority to deal with the surrender of an army. And he's been told that explicitly several times by both Lincoln and by Secretary of War Stanton. And so when this was being written, Grant actually sat down with a manifold book, which was something that made 3 copies for people that are old enough to remember when we had carbon paper, something similar to that. And he used a pencil at first. And he sat and wrote out these terms based on the letters that he had been exchanging. He famously says in his memoirs that when he sat down to write, he didn't know what he was going to say. It's the words just kind of flowed forth. He had a pretty good idea of what he was going to say, but after he'd written it, he shows it to Lee. Lee does point out there's one really interesting thing in this that Grant doesn't talk about, but we know about this from other sources, that he had left out the part about until properly exchanged. And Lee said, you said that in the letter that you sent on the 8th. And so Grant goes back and makes a change to that in the draft. It's important for Lee that until properly exchanged, because it suggests that if those other Confederate armies are successful, then those soldiers can be, to be exchanged means we have your prisoners and you have some of our prisoners and we'll swap, and those men can then fight again. So it's Lee holding out hope, but it's also Grant saying, fine, have at it. It's him pretty clear that this is the end game anyway. So then General Ellie Parker is going to write it out, the formal copies that we see on official stationery. He will write that in pen, and that's what's then made 2 copies of. One goes to the Confederates, and one will be sent to the War Department. And then multiple copies, just like we'll talk about with General Orders Number 9, such as this, are made as souvenirs. So it's really important for men on either side to hold on to these as souvenirs.
Do you think it's useful for students to compare this document to something from the Revolution? We have the Articles of Capitulation signed at Yorktown, and it's such a different looking document.
I think that would be such a fun, it's going to be my word, exercise to use. And thinking about the language that they use, one of the things to also point out, which was a slightly different document, but part of that series of letters, one of the things that Grant says is he'd like to avoid a further effusion of blood, which is exactly the language that Washington and Cornwallis are using. And so you can see those echoes of earlier surrenders, capitulations, flowing through these documents as well. Be fun to point out both construction of the document, the physical document, but also the rhetoric and language
Mhm.
that they're using.
All right, fantastic. And then, of course, General Orders number 9, which has to be one of the most eloquent general orders I've ever read. I haven't read them all, but I've seen a lot, and they're just, it's so poetic. It's beautifully written.
It is. It is, and you can see why so many copies were made. I was playing around last night just on eBay and different sites, and there were all of these lithograph copies that were made. These two were souvenirs, but men in the field wanted them as well. And there are quite a few. So we'll talk about when they're created in the field, copies are made for the corps commanders and for the staff of Lee's army. And individually, after it's been read to the men, they will go to Lee and ask him to sign it. And Charles Marshall, who's the aide who writes this, says years later that men were sitting around camp copying this and going to Lee throughout the day before he heads off to Richmond, asking him to sign it. But then for the 5 years until his death, he was constantly being asked to sign copies. So one of the things to be on the alert for, if you come across one of these, is it doesn't mean that it was necessarily at Appomattox.
Mhm.
It could legitimately be Lee's signature, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it was ever physically at Appomattox, because so many of these were produced over the years, or the 5 years before his death in 1870, as souvenirs.
And what I've always found interesting is how the kind of pen somebody uses affects whether or not it's legible. And this is like a really fine nib, and it's really hard to read. Plus, it's so big. If we zoom this in, you could probably look at it, but we also make transcripts because we want students to be able to read documents, and handwriting isn't always taught anymore. If you had to pick a favorite phrase, one that you think that people should look at, which one would it be?
Of the general orders.
Of General Orders.
Oh goodness, that's a hard one. I can tell you that it's not necessarily a favorite phrase, but one in which loyal Northerners took great offense, was, if you look 3 lines up from the bottom, devotion to your country, with unceasing admiration of your constancy and devotion to your country. When Lee did an interview with New York Times on April 24th, and people were offended by his interview, but they were even more offended when the general orders were reprinted. And the notion that the Confederacy and Lee in this particular moment still talking about a separate country was incredibly offensive to the loyal North.
With how widespread was this printed in northern newspapers?
Oh, it was reprinted in all of them. I mean, everywhere. San Francisco, you could find this, as look, they haven't really capitulated. They have, and we can see that, and many of Lee's men carry this as the reason they want to hold on to it is this is proof. This is proof that they weren't defeated, that they were simply overwhelmed. It's be interesting to also compare this to diary entries of Union soldiers.
Mhm.
I found many Union soldiers who said, man, we wanted one more pitched battle where we annihilated that army. But Lee can use these orders to say, you were never annihilated. You were simply worn down. So I think there's so many of these passages that you can take the time. I mean, almost every sentence you can dig into, and the feeling devotion could accomplish nothing that would compensate that loss. I mean, you could spend an entire class dissecting what this meant in reaction to it as well.
And it's a great opportunity to work with English teachers too, to help break down that language so that students can understand it.
Absolutely.
But we actually have several different copies of General Orders number 9. And so this copy over here actually accompanied the parole pass that we had from Appomattox, and it belonged to John Henry Williams, who, after he was wounded, became a courier between his regiment and the quartermaster. And so the provenance for this document is that he brought the orders back to camp. They were posted, and then he asked his commanding officer if he could keep them, and the officer said yes.
And obviously it has Lee's signature, so it's
Yeah.
someone went to Lee and got the signature.
But this one on this side, incredibly messy, but it is just what we call a foot soldier's copy. So it's one of those soldiers who was writing it out in camp just to remember it by, to have a souvenir. It is not signed by Lee. So you can see Lee's signature here, and then someone wrote their own R.E. Lee down at the bottom. So this might be a strange question, but out of all of the copies of General Orders Number 9, do you have a favorite one?
I like those that are on that blue paper. Do you know what I'm talking about? It's
Yeah,
I don't know the actual term for what that paper
yeah.
is called, but it's a beautiful period paper of substantial stock and thickness, and those are and those are usually original copies that were in fact signed by Lee.
Do you have anything else we should know about this before we jump to audience questions?
I don't think so. Let's get to some questions.
Okay, this one's from Tom. He's a K-12 educator. Did Lincoln approve of the terms of surrender?
It's a great question. So not in the moment. There was certainly the ability to telegraph, telegraph Washington, but Grant has instructions. He along with General Sherman and Admiral Porter, had met with Lincoln aboard the River Queen, a boat in late March 30th, I believe it was. And Lincoln was quite clear about how he wanted Confederates to be treated. The whole notion of the war was to reunite the country. And so, just as he had said in his second inaugural, which we want to talk about beautiful prose, second inaugural wins hands down every time, but with malice toward none, uh, this is what Lincoln has been saying. He's been very clear that Grant cannot negotiate political issues. Peace is a political issue. Restoration of state governments in the Confederacy are state issues, or excuse me, political issues. Grant can only deal with the surrender of an army, and he trusts Grant to deal with that. In fact, when there was a meeting, when Lincoln meets for a potential peace conference in February with Confederate leaders, Grant is explicitly not allowed because he is a military official, not a political leader. So short version is Lincoln doesn't officially approve them, but Grant believes, and I believe he was doing exactly what Lincoln wanted him to do. And Lincoln approves of them once he sees them, but there's no checking in with the commander in chief to make sure at that moment.
Yeah.
Great question.
Yeah. This one is from Lois, who, if it's the Lois I'm thinking of, is also a K-12 educator and
I
also
think I
writes.
know Lois. Hey, Lois.
She said she looked up Sailor's Creek, and it's a 15-hour walk to Appomattox. Thank you, Google, for making the directions like that. And she wants to know, how many miles did the Army of Northern Virginia travel on a night march?
On any given night, I'm not sure of the exact number of miles on any given night, but it's about 100 miles from Richmond and or Petersburg to Appomattox. So they are, 20 miles over the course of 24 hours. They're doing, because they're also fighting along the way, and they're spending time. When they get to Amelia Courthouse, they expect to have rations waiting there, and they expect the people in the countryside and the surrounding area to provide them food, and they don't. So in part, when they get to places like Amelia Courthouse, they have to keep moving, and so they are exhausted. They are just absolutely wiped. They are famished. They are doing this on 2 to 3 hours of sleep at most at night. The other thing to keep in mind is the pursuing Union forces are doing the exact same thing. And so they are equally as tired. Now they are galvanized, and the adrenaline the notion that they are going to bag Lee's army. That's one of the quotes from a diary. They can get some energy from that, but it's an equally arduous task to have to keep up with the relentless pace of Lee's army as he pushes ever westward.
Okay, do you know how they chose the McLean house? Like, is it because where it was situated on the battlefield?
Well, it was the best place within the small village of Appomattox Courthouse. I mean, it's a tiny village. There's at the time, and you can go to it now. It's a restored. It's a wonderful place to visit. A quaint little village. The Clover Hill Tavern was initially thought of as a place, but it was kind of dark and not conducive to the number of people that would be in the room. McLean's Parlor was simply the best, and there were several other homes, but that was the grandest home in the village. And so some of the staff officers had gone out and scouted around to see where in the village would be the best place, and that's why it's chosen.
This is a really good question. So, what were the logistics of getting Southern men home? And I'm going to give you an example. John Henry Williams, the person who had this document, his family said it took him about 2 weeks to get home to South Carolina. But in general, what were the logistics of getting the Southern men home?
Yeah, so it depended on not only where they were going, if they're going to Arkansas or Tennessee, or it also depended on how they're going to travel. So there's as many different men as there are that many different stories about how they got home. A lot of them that are heading to states like North Carolina and South Carolina are first going to march, many of them staying together as brigades and even divisions as they march away from Appomattox, heading south toward Danville, Virginia, which is right on the border of Virginia and North Carolina, trying to make their way there, and then into Greensboro, North Carolina, which has working railroads. And both of those places, they can potentially get on railroads and move faster. Problem is, railroads are torn up in many places. You might remember that Sherman's army has been coming through and destroying the railroads. So there's lots of stories of men who will get on a train at one station and they'll be able to ride it maybe 20 miles, maybe 50 miles, and then the tracks will be torn up and they'll have to get off and walk to find their way to another train station. A lot of the men are using those parole passes to go to, so even men from deep South states will head east in Virginia, making their way to City Point, which is a point on the Appomattox where the Appomattox and James rivers come together, and it's fairly good-sized steamers could get into port there. And if they had that parole pass, they could use US-run government steamers and sail to places like Savannah or to New Orleans and otherwise. So the timing of the trip depended on whether they tried to walk, whether they had access to trains, whether they had access to steamers. Some of the problems that they run into, they're told to be on their quickest and most expedient route home. There's a group of, this happens to a lot of different soldiers, but one particular group of soldiers from Tennessee go to Fortress Monroe, where they want to catch a steamer that will take them up the Chesapeake Bay to Baltimore. And from Baltimore, they want to take the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad west and eventually take railroads down to Nashville, into Kentucky and down to Nashville. So anyway, they're going to go east to the coast and sail north and try to make their way to Tennessee that way. But they get stopped at Fortress Monroe and they're imprisoned and they're held there because the provost marshals are saying, what do you mean you're on your quickest and most direct route home? Why are you coming here and trying to sail north? Lee has to intercede and Grant eventually allows them to go. But there are lots of men who think that it would be easier to sail north into Northern Loyal territory to make their way home. So it's not just transportation that's a problem, it's food, getting rations. Remember that except for officers, no one has guns. So it's not like you can go out and shoot a squirrel or some other rabbit or any other type of animal. to feed yourself, you're going to have to beg and scrape. Most of them don't have any Confederate script, let alone greenbacks at this point. So the challenges were real, which is part of the reason that Grant wants to expedite the process and initially says that they can travel free on government transports. That'll change as all those Confederates keep coming into Baltimore and DC and New York City.
Yeah. There was a follow-up to that question, which I can answer really quickly. Someone asked if these documents ever been on display side by side. And that answer is yes. About 5 years ago, in 2015, we had them on display in a Civil War 150 exhibition. So they haven't been on display since then because you can't have paper documents displayed too long because the light actually damages them and makes the ink fade. That was a really simple question. I have two more like that I'm hoping we have time for. And the next one's from Presley, and he or she, I apologize, wants to know, how should we as historians and teachers approach the idea of souvenir taking and navigating that with students?
Well, wonderful question as well. I think it's a very, at least 19th, 20th, 21st century response to things, relics, souvenirs. Think about the origins of the word souvenir, the French to see and to be able to take with you as a piece of it. I think that it's important to think about the different roles that documents play, that you have the actual words of special orders or general orders, excuse me, number 9, but the words alone mean something different if you have that tangible object, that evidence. For some people, a souvenir is I was part of something. For some, it was history and it was important because it was there. And so that's why I'm personally so fascinated with both material culture and archival collections and where they came from and how they pass around. Sometimes there's multiple layers of meaning attached to a document or to an item. And so the parole passes, for example, those parole passes for many men were proof that they had been there to the end, that they didn't drop out of the ranks, that they weren't cowards who refused to surrender. Many of them felt the same way about General Orders Number 9, because I believe that Lee writes that to the men who are still there, not those who took off, not those, and again, about 20,000 of those took off, many for various reasons, and didn't surrender. But he's saying, you're the devoted ones, you are here. And so having a copy of that you hold on to, especially if it's there with your parole pass, has incredibly powerful meaning for these men who have been defeated and their cause, Grant says it's the worst cause for which anyone could ever fight. And yet he understood that this was something that they had believed in and how crushing it was. And so holding on to those items, I think it's important to help our students understand that items and documents can have many different meanings for many different people, and that can change over time.
Okay. I think I could answer this question, but I'm going to ask you, do you know specifically why there are no photographs taken of the official surrender in the McLean house?
Because there were no photographers there. It's a great question.
Yep.
They weren't there.
Yeah, there's photographers everywhere, but not there. And one last question, which is more of a request, because the person asked something which I think is too, and there's a lot of questions, like there's 3 pages on our question sheet. So thank you all for being so engaged this evening. But Octavia was asking questions about documents that refer to participation of enslaved and freedmen in the war. Are there any books that you could recommend for that? Because I think it's just we could go on for another hour on that topic, but are there any books you could recommend off the top of your head?
On participation of enslaved people.
Or freedmen in the war. So,
oh my goodness, there are so many books, but I'll just give one. Amy Taylor's Embattled Freedom is a wonderful book that looks at the refugee camps created by the United States Army, but also created by the enslaved men and women who made their way to the Union lines to carve out space for themselves. So they might have been called contraband in an earlier generation, but they were absolutely refugees from war. So Amy Taylor's In Battle Freedom is the first place to start, but there are so many books I could recommend on the topic.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that. And we're going to go to upcoming programs in just a second, but I want to personally say thank you for saying Fortress Monroe, because I've always said Fortress Monroe and other people say Fort Monroe, and it's just, it's a thing for me. I'm just happy to hear you say it.
In case this matters, I was just there a couple weeks ago and all of the signage does say Fort Monroe, but I still say Fortress.
Yeah. And Lee helped build Fortress Monroe. We have letters that he wrote while he was there, and he called it Fortress Monroe. So I'll follow Lee's example on that one. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Molly, who's going to tell us about some upcoming programs.
Hi, everybody. So our next Inside the Vault will be held on May 2nd at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, and will feature Dr. Deborah Moore of the University of Michigan. Book breaks. The next book breaks will be held on Sunday, April 14th at 2 p.m. Eastern with Dr. Tomiko Brown-Nayin, who will discuss her book Civil Rights Queen, Constance Baker Motley and the Struggle for Equality. And if you'd like to learn more about Appomattox and the end of the Civil War, you can find Dr. Janney's book, Ends of War, in our bookshop.
And we also have a scholarship for students. The deadline to apply is April 15th, so you have a few more days. It is sponsored by the Gilder Lehrman Institute and the National History Academy, and we're once again offering this to 20 students to attend a residential summer program exclusively for our affiliate schools. So please do apply for that. You have a URL there if you guys want to. It should be popped into the chat. So Hannah and Molly will take care of that for you in just a second. And I want to say thank you, Dr. Janney, because that was an absolutely amazing. Of course, I'm biased. I absolutely love the Civil War. It's one of my favorite historical periods to talk about, but a fantastic talk. And I love when historians can not just recite the facts, but weave a picture and talk about the human experience as well. And fantastic job. And thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. And thank you to everyone out there for spending the evening with us.
And with that, I'm going to say good night and thank you for attending. Bye.